So this is a video summarising the variations of Milgram's experiment and his agency theory, and I'll even put a few evaluation points in there to help out. So remember, you need to know 3 variations of Milgram. He did 18 in total, including his original experiment, but these are the 3 that you need to know. So Milgram's kind of variations in his original experiment show beautifully the idea that we are a science, that we use what we call the hypothetical deductive model. Milgram came up with his hypothesis that the Germans are different, and then he came up with a testable way of measuring that by seeing how many people went to 450 volts. What he found, the results that showed that Americans were just as kind of obedient as Germans, made him change his theory. And he came up with that list of ideas about why they were more just as obedient. It was the fact that there was an authority figure and it was held at Yale University. The fact that they were far away from the person and didn't have to kind of deliver the electric shocks right in front of them. Things like that were factors. And so what he ended up doing was coming up with other experiments to test those ideas. And that's what these 3 variations are. So Milgram's study, which is labelled as Experiment 7, is where the experimenter gives the instructions over the telephone, or you could also refer to it as him being a distant authority figure. So the aim was to see if the proximity from the experimenter to the teacher has an effect on obedience level. So the method was exactly the same. They met Mr. Wallace, there was the rigged draw, all of that sort of stuff. But then after giving the initial instructions, the experimenter, the guy in the lab coat, left the room. All of the further interactions he had with the teacher were over a telephone, a bit like Deal or No Deal. So the experimenter sat in another room, and the teacher just carried on with the experiment, giving the electric shocks. Any prods he had to give, so the teacher would have to pick up the telephone and say, look, I want to leave this experiment, I don't want to take part in it anymore, I've clearly hurt Mr. Wallace. The experimenter would then deliver the prods over the telephone. So he's not in the same room anymore, he's in a different room. The results fell from 65% of people getting to 450 volts to only 22.5%. What they also saw in the results were that people lied about the shocks that they were giving. They said that they'd given the 300 volt shock when really they'd stopped at 200 and hadn't been given the shocks any higher since then. If the experimenter returned to the room, then the disobedience decreased. The disobedience ceased, and they started being obedient as if they had been in the original experiment. The conclusion of this is that the proximity between the experimenter and the teacher impacts on obedience. If the experimenter, if the authority figure is far away, then obedience will decrease, or people will indeed lie about what they're doing. Experiment number 10, or variation number 10, was a rundown office block. So Milgram wanted to see if changing from the prestigious Yale University to a kind of rundown office block in the area would affect the obedience. The interviews from the original suggested that the fact that it was done at Yale University was a big factor. So participants were recruited through a mail shot. Basically, they put leaflets through their door. And they told that the research was being conducted by a private research company. So no longer Yale University, but another company. And those that took part reported to a rundown office building. There wasn't very much furniture. It was just very much an old building in the middle of a town. And then they went through the exact same procedure, except it wasn't associated with Yale University anymore. And what we found was there was a 48% obedience, with 48% of people going all the way to 450 volts. Participants were much more likely here, though, to question the credentials of the company and basically question whether they had a right to be doing this research. Experiment 13 was an ordinary man giving the orders. So the aim was to study the effects of power relations. So again, the guy in the suit and tie, the experimenter in the original study, was a strong authority figure. And Milgram wanted to find out what would happen if they did it with a not so strong authority figure. So he was an ordinarily dressed man. He was basically another Confederate who the real participant thought was a participant. So for the method, the 3 participants, 2 of them being a Confederate, 1 being Mr. Wallace and 1 being this other guy, arrived and went through a rigged draw to determine who was the learner, the teacher and the experimenter. Again, the real participant was always going to be the teacher. The experimenter, who is again the Confederate who the naive participant believes is a real participant, followed the instructions to strap the learner into the chair. So he strapped Mr. Wallace into the chair, but didn't tell the teacher what levels of shock to give. The experimenter receives a phone call to leave the room. So this Confederate now leaves the room and tells the teacher that he's meant to just keep going on, letting Mr. Wallace practice the words. It was the learner's idea to start increasing the shocks. So Mr. Wallace, in this case, once he got an electric shock, he went, what would really help me learn these better is if there was some sort of real punishment. Every time I get one of these wrong, you increase the shock level. So it came from the learner, the idea to keep going up with those shock levels. And he kept restating this throughout the procedure. The results came out at about 20% obedience levels. So 20% of people got all the way to 450 volts. The learner, Mr. Wallace, had to be very persuasive to get the teacher to continue with the experiment. Sorry, Mr. Word off there. To continue with the procedure. He always wanted to keep dropping out, and the learner had to keep saying, yeah, you should keep going. You have to keep doing this. To resolve this issue, something that Milgram did in another variation, but it still gets counted as number 13, is the learner, Mr. Wallace, actually started to give himself the shocks. He told the teacher just to sit there and kind of measure or monitor how long he gave himself each shock for. In this kind of little mini variation, all 16 participants protested, and 5 had to physically restrain the learner from giving themselves the electric shocks because they were that uncomfortable with how much pain it was causing. So 11 went to 450 volts. That's 68.75%. And that is partially because they don't have to do anything. Since they were removed and it wasn't them having to give the electric shocks, we get kind of a baseline of what percentage would be happy seeing people get electric shocks, things like that. Bomrind identified an evaluation point of this. So the usual evaluation points of Milgram's study stand, but Bomrind identified another one. Remember, on Milgram's experiment, we often give him kind of a pass on some of the ethical ideas because he had no idea how far people would go. But Bomrind pointed out that during these 18 variations with 636 participants, Milgram totally understood how upsetting this experiment was. So if you count all of these variations, then that ethical kind of exception where it wasn't his fault goes out of the window. So because of these experiments, Milgram was able to come up with his agency theory. Remember, his theory that Germans were different is totally out of the window now. So he came up with this theory. And it argues that humans are socialized into an agentic state from an early age. We are told from childhood to obey our parents, to listen to teachers, to follow social rules, to listen to what the police say, and things like that. And living in a human society, we've basically evolved as a species to follow these sort of orders to avoid conflict. Yeah, if we do what other people tell us, it avoids kind of fighting and things like that, and helps society, our groups, our families run more smoothly. So because of this, we've developed 2 states. We've got the autonomous state, and the autonomous state is where we are free thinking, we are able to make our own decisions. You basically act under the will of your own conscience, and that's an important key bit that's not written down here. Your conscience decides on your behavior. And then we've got the agentic state. The agentic state is the state that we move into from the autonomous state when we've got an authority figure telling us what to do. And we give up our consciences and we act under the control of somebody else. We give up responsibilities for our actions and we act as the agents of other people. And importantly, lots of people miss this out, we obey. We do what an authority figure tells us because we have given up kind of our own conscience and we are acting as their agent. Moving from the autonomous state into the agentic state is called the agentic shift, as we can see with these 2 pugs here. So Milgram suggested that there were 2 things needed to be in this agentic state. First off, the person giving the orders must be perceived as an authority figure. They are seen to be a legitimate authority. And again, this is the case in Milgram's experiment with the experimenter in a lab coat. And 2, the person being ordered is able to believe that the authority will accept responsibility. Remember, in Milgram's original experiment, the experimenter kept saying things like he was responsible. If a soldier follows an order, like in the Holocaust, they expect that their commanding officer will be the one that takes responsibility. Moral strain is kind of the final part of this theory, and moral strain is basically guilt when people feel uncomfortable with going against their own values. Remember, when we go into the agentic state, however, we manage to get around this because the authority figure takes responsibility. So even though we're going against our own conscience or our own values, it's because we're being told to by this person who is responsible. But moral strain is basically feeling uneasy or uncomfortable with going against your own values. So we've got a couple of evaluation points for this. Remember, we'll use Scout to evaluate a theory. So supporting evidence comes from Milgram. We could also use these variations. We can use Berger and things like that. So remember, he supports it because 65% of people showed the agentic shift and went into the agentic state and delivered that 450 volt shock because the authority figure told them to do it. However, conflicting evidence people often miss out is that if 65% of people gave the shock, that means 35% didn't. Milgram's agency theory has no way of explaining why 35% of people resisted. And we'll talk about other theories of obedience in another video, which obviously shows why that might be. But the agency theory at the moment says that everyone will do this, and it doesn't explain why some people resisted. This has real-life applications. It explains the Holocaust in World War II. Remember, when you're doing this in an exam, you should be explaining very clearly that the soldiers were in the agentic state. Sorry, first of all, they were in the autonomous, then they shifted to the agentic and followed these orders because of the authority of the commanding officer. The idea of an agentic state is very difficult to pin down. It's kind of a circular argument. We say that we learn from a young age, that children learn to obey, that children have this agentic state and will obey because their parents have always taught them to. But surely that's them being obedient in the first place by following what that parents say. So we can argue that this agentic state thing is kind of a circular argument. We say that people obey because they're in the agentic state, and we know they're in the agentic state because they've obeyed. There's no kind of explanation of why that might necessarily be. There's also no physical evidence of an agentic state occurring. We can't look at any brain scans and pick it out and go, this is when somebody is obedient. Evolutionary theories are also very hard to kind of test or prove because we can't test it on the original people, such as our ancestors. It essentially goes down to inferences, and we can't do actual experiments on that. We'll get into the alternative explanations more in depth as we go on, such as authoritarian personality. One, however, is French and Raven's types of power, and there are 5 different types of power that Milgram didn't account for, and these types of power are possible reasons why kind of authority figures have authority. Right, thanks very much.